Hi everyone. Today I want to talk to you about a way of categorizing the kids that you see in the classroom on Sundays that might help you to better anticipate behaviors. But first let me start by saying that it's not uncommon that for most of the kids that we have in our classroom, they have varying degrees of cognitive inflexibility. And what I mean by that is that they have a difficult time shifting from their agenda to your agenda. And that's one of the reasons that they're in our classroom. Some of the diagnoses that the kids have, such as autism spectrum disorder or Asperger's, reactional attachment disorder, ADHD, are the types of diagnoses that can lend themselves to having cognitive inflexibility. And so the way to look at it is this, is there's basically three types of kiddos. Child number one is going to be a child who has cognitive flexibility and can shift from their agenda to your agenda, so that when you say it's time to stop playing with Thomas the Tank Engine and come over to this table and sit down and do the lesson plan, they'll be very compliant with doing that, because again, they can shift from their agenda to your agenda. It's typically not a problem. Child number two is going to have a little bit more of a tougher time doing that. When you say, let's stop playing with Thomas the Tank Engine and come down and sit down and do our lesson plan for today, they're not going to be quite as compliant. And typically with that kind of kiddo, you just have to introduce some type of consequences. If you want to be able to come back and play with Thomas the Tank Engine, then you need to stop playing now, come and do the lesson, and then you can come back and play with Thomas the Tank Engine. Or if there's another preferred activity or item that they like, it could be, it's time to stop playing with Thomas the Tank Engine and come down and sit down and do our lesson, and then afterwards you can go to the sensory room, or afterwards you can play with the iPad, whatever it might be. So child number two is a little bit less flexible. They have a little bit harder time shifting from their agenda to your agenda, but consequences typically motivate them to do so, especially if the consequence is a pleasurable one. On the other hand, it could be one that's fairly negative, and we try not to do that in the classroom. So picking a favored positive consequence typically will help overcome that situation. And then you have child number three, and child number three is the child who is very cognitively inflexible, which means that they have a very, very hard time shifting from their agenda to your agenda. And this is a child that typically, when you introduce a consequence, such as first you need to do A and then you can do B, as I just talked about, isn't going to do that. And it's because of something called executive function, or in a deficit in executive function, that makes that kind of shift very difficult for them, and they become very stuck on what it is that they're wanting to do and not wanting to do what anyone else wants them to do. And we've had kids like that in the classroom. If you run into them, you know who they are. Anyhow, this is the kind of kiddo that it's important that you say what you mean and you mean what you say. They need to be able to see that, but you have to be really good at picking and choosing those battles. And for me in the classroom, I have a set of non-negotiables. And I think it's important that you have those too. You have to decide what's negotiable and what's non-negotiable. Does child three absolutely positively have to stop what they're doing and come over to the table and do the lesson plan for Sunday? No, they don't. You have the option of bringing the lesson plan to them where they're at and within the context of what they're doing. You also have the option of doing what's called activity-based instruction, which is simply teaching them the lesson plan in the context of the activity that they're doing. And so you don't have to go there. But the non-negotiables I think that we have in the classroom that should remain consistent amongst all of us are the things that involve these following things. And really there's only two. Things that could be safety issues for children. One, if they are doing something that could possibly harm themselves, like standing on top of the table or trying to climb on top of bookshelves, these are things in which a child could hurt him or herself. That's non-negotiable. That child has to shift from that agenda of doing that thing that they want to do to your agenda. And then number two is the things that they're doing that possibly could cause harm to another child in the classroom, such as throwing a wooden block deliberately at somebody, or perhaps just randomly throwing a block, but it could hit someone in the head and cause some type of damage. That's another non-negotiable. And so for me in the classroom, for child number 3, who has an extremely difficult time shifting from their agenda to my agenda, I'm going to ask myself, are they crossing the threshold of either one of these non-negotiables? In other words, by sticking to their agenda, are they causing themselves to be in some kind of danger, or are they causing themselves to be causing someone else to be in some type of danger? And if that's the case, then it's not negotiable. They have to shift from what they're doing to what I want them to do. And in that case, I have to follow through and make that happen. And sometimes that physically, like with Micah, if some of you remember Micah or some of the other kids that we have, it may be that you have to physically pick them up and move them from point A to point B, or take something from them like a projectile. Anyhow, those are the 3 different types of kiddos. It all is based on categorizing them by degrees of cognitive inflexibility, or cognitive flexibility if you want to look at it like that. Child number 1 is cognitively flexible. They can shift from their agenda to your agenda, no problem when you ask. Child number 2 is a child that has a little bit tougher time, and they can shift from their agenda to your agenda, but it usually only comes as a result of issuing some type of consequence. And you need to work on trying to make sure that that's a positive consequence. It could be a negative consequence, but positive consequences tend to motivate kids better. And then child number 3 is a child who has an extreme difficulty shifting from their agenda to your agenda. Typically, they just simply aren't going to, consequences or not. And that's when you need to think about those non-negotiables. Is this something that's causing themselves to be in harm's way, or someone else to be in harm's way? And if so, you need to help them make that shift. And if not, possibly rethink that and not fight that battle.